All right, hey everyone, just want to reiterate, again, it is so amazing to be back up on the stage and to see people, and virtual conferences have turned out to be incredibly accessible and I think very important for many people, and I hope that we continue to learn lessons from them, and I hope that we continue to use them in the best possible way, but also, dear God, have I missed this. The last time I was able to give a talk in person was actually right here in Portland for LISA, the very last LISA conference, LISA 2019 in early November. So it's been 2.5 years, and it's so wonderful to see so many of your faces, and it's so great to be back here again. So I do want to give a quick content warning. We're going to be talking about various different transportation accidents during this talk. I won't go into any gory details, but there will be pictures or wrecks. We will be talking about numbers in terms of potentially deceased people and injured people, and just wanted to lay that out ahead of time. If you want to leave or log off right now, I will not be offended in the least. So I want to start this off by talking about the DC Metro system. So the DC Metro system is actually pretty cool. At 117 miles of total track length, and in fact, in a few months, they're supposed to open some new tracks that will put this at 131 miles. It's the second largest, or the second longest system in the entire US, outside of only New York City. At 91 total stations, it's the third largest, behind only Chicago and New York. And at 57 million yearly riders, it's at the 5th busiest total light rail system we have in this country. And the other thing is really interesting about the DC Metro, to me at least, is that it's fairly new. A lot of the light rail systems that we have today that we think of as large, such as New York and Chicago and Boston, they were all started a century or more ago. But the very first segment of DC Metro track that opened was on March 27th in 1976, when 4 stations on the Red Line opened. And then about 15 months later, the Blue Line opened, and the first kind of, cohesive idea of a real transportation system really kind of emerged. And then in between 1977 and 1991, the orange, yellow, and green lines opened, and it really kind of became a full-fledged transportation system. And again, I think it's kind of interesting. That's only about 30 years ago that really kind of hit that point. And then on July 26th of 2014, the Silver Line opened. And the Silver Line to me is really interesting because I spent my middle and high school years, my teenage years, living in Northern Virginia. I live in Sterling, Virginia, and the Silver Line, as of 2014, extends all the way to Reston, Virginia, which is right next door. And this would have been so useful to me as a high schooler, living 30, 40 miles outside of DC city proper, to be able to jump on this and head into Georgetown to go shopping, or downtown DC to see a show, something like that. And actually scheduled for this fall, in just the next few months, the next 3 stops, extending another 12 miles, which will go all the way out to Ashburn, Virginia, for anyone who knows that area. But there's another date in DC Metro history that is very infamous, and that would be June 22nd of 2009. That's when the Fort Totten crash happened. And 8 passengers lost their lives. The train operator of train 112 was also deceased, and 80 people were injured bad enough they had to go to the hospital. Countless others were injured but felt okay to go home. So my name is Alex Hidalgo. For those of you who have not yet met, I'm the Principal Reliability Advocate at Noble 9. And regardless of what my title is today, I consider myself an SRE through and through. I spent 7 years at Google, 7 years at Squarespace, and am now at Noble 9. And keeping things reliable is truly my passion at this point. Now, I want to talk to you today about meaningful measurements. And you might be asking yourself a little bit about, what do you actually mean with measurements, right? We all likely know what the word means in a dictionary sense, but it's not one that's often used, at least not at a conference like Monitorama, where we generally talk about monitoring. So I want to spend the rest of this talk doing a deep dive into ISO document 9001 revision 2015. No, I'm kidding. That would be incredibly boring. But I will be using it as kind of a jumping off point, right? ISO documents do a great job at defining things and ensuring we have a common language, which I think is very important. We don't share a vernacular across the industry. It can be difficult to talk about things. So I do think the way that ISO 9001 revision 2015 describes monitoring versus measurement, I think is actually pretty good. So let's do a TLDR. Let's do a too long didn't brief. So monitoring versus measurement, at least as defined in this sense, monitoring is essentially surveillance, right? It is watching your systems. It's watching the components of your systems. It is collecting data from those systems. It is many, many numbers. It is many, many logs. It is many, many things. And very explicitly, monitoring is defined as being over time. So monitoring occurs over a 30-day time period. You can say that your CPU utilization was, Y% at this point in time, and all that. But measuring, tells you how your system is actually behaving at this point. What are the traits of my system from an outside observer? And also, I think very importantly, measurements are explicitly right now. Monitoring happens over time. A measurement says, right now, what is going on? Right now, what is the state of my system? And more importantly, measurements aren't just about the state of your system, but what is the state of your system in comparison with the requirements of what your system is supposed to be doing, right? So monitoring collects a whole ton of data, right? You may have hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of individual time series that you're collecting off your various different Kubernetes pods and all sorts of various, distributed systems you have, and that is useful. I'm not here today to tell you to not monitor. But the point is monitoring is just about getting all that data that you may or may not use, that may or may not actually tell you anything about how your system is behaving. But measuring via these definitions, tell you how are things actually going in comparison with the operational requirements we have. And these operational requirements can be defined in a bunch of different ways. It might be an offset, right? It might be our data is reporting X, but we don't get to actually observe this data until X plus 2, right? Like 2 minutes may pass before you're able to actually understand how things are going. And if that's the case, you need to understand that your measurements are in fact 2 minutes delayed. Otherwise, you cannot make the correct decisions. Thresholds are a thing that are often brought into place with measurements as opposed to monitoring, right? Monitoring is just data. Monitoring is just, here is my time series, here is the value at time. But a threshold can tell you, okay, but is that number that we're getting for that time series, is it in fact within a boundary, within a range, or a greater than or less than operator, whatever it might be? Is that actually relevant to how we want our system to be running right now? Measurements also include things like aggregates, right? So you can take data from many different systems, bring them all together into a single value that you can then evaluate, or combinations. You may have many different data points that all look disparate and don't really have any seeming commonality that you can all combine into a single measurement that does in fact tell you how is our system operating right now. And with all that out of the way, you may be saying, aren't I already doing measuring with my monitoring today? And you very well may be, especially if you have alert conditions, especially if you have defined, here are times that I want to be notified when my monitoring is telling me that my system is not operating how I want it to. That would be a measurement. But I think that distinctions are important. I think it's important for us to always be on the same page and kind of agree on what means what. And this ISO 9001 document, this monitoring versus measurement, like these definitions, they're really mostly used in quality management systems. So the business side of things, right? Like the orgs that determine whether or not your organization is living up to expectations. It's not a thing that as engineers we always love, but we can in fact learn things from them. And I think their definitions are pretty good overall. But for right now, let's get back to the DC Metro. So at 4:57 Eastern Daylight Time on Monday, June 22nd of 2009, Metro Train 112 departed from the Tacoma station. And at 4:57 Eastern Daylight Time, Metro Train 214 halted outside of the Fort Totten station. It was informed that there was a train ahead of it. A train was held up, someone hit the emergency button, and so the doors stayed open and this train did not depart. So train 214 was stalled and train 112 was approaching it. And at 5:02, train 112 rear-ended train 214 at 49 miles an hour. So how did this happen? This isn't a talk about incident retrospectives. I'm a huge fan of learning from incidents. I'm a huge fan of the concept of many contributing factors, and I could give an entire talk. We could talk for hours just about all the things that colluded, that occurred at the same time, that led to this incident happening. But that's not what I want to spend the whole talk about. So if you do care, I love NTSB reports. They are sometimes a little morose. They're sometimes a little gruesome, right? They're generally the National Transportation Safety Bureau, for those who don't know the NTSB, but like they write up very comprehensive learning from incident reports about any major traffic accident that occurs. And if you do want to go read about it, go. Document number RAR 1002. The link is here. Go find me afterwards or just Google DC Metro NTSB. You'll probably find it. The point is I don't want to spend the whole talk on this. There's many, many different things that went wrong. But for our purposes, it kind of started here. On Wednesday, June 17th, just 5 days before, a track circuit was replaced. Now, a track circuit is not a replacement of the actual physical track line. It is a replacement of the systems that power and monitor this portion of track. But unfortunately, this replacement system, although it was replacing one that was entirely broken, did not function very well. It dealt from parasitic oscillations. Parasitic oscillations are a state that systems can get into where they report data that does not always correspond to the real world. They report good data and then bad data and good data and then bad data, right? And sometimes this is on a very predictable pattern. Sometimes it's not on a predictable pattern. But the point is, this is a commonly understood state that many systems can get into, to the point it has its own name. Right? It has its own Wikipedia article that you can go read about. It's a very common state for systems to get into, and you may recognize this kind of idea from some of the own computer systems that you have been responsible for. I mean, this is essentially the concept of a flapping alert. Right? You've probably at some point in time been responsible for a service that has entered some kind of state where it suddenly tells you, oh, I'm bad, oh, it's good. Oh, things are bad. Oh, it's good. Oh, and some of this sends you pages over and over again, and it wakes you up at 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. and 5 a.m. and over and over and over and over again. And this kind of thing, these kind of metrics, makes measurements difficult. Right? You are still monitoring your system. You're still getting the data out from your system, but you're not measuring it because you're not actually getting a good understanding of what the actual state of the world is. And this data, in case of the DC Metro, is sent to the Automatic Train Control System, or ATC. And so the DC Metro operates with train operators. Every train has an operator at the front of the train, so they can spot things ahead of them, and so they can react. But in general, the ATC tells the trains what to do, and the train operators are just there as kind of like a fail-safe, to be honest. And unfortunately, due to this parasitic oscillation, the people in charge of the ATC had turned off all alerts from that segment of track because they could not be trusted. They were constantly erroring and then not, alerting and then not. So that was just turned off. And in a very unfortunate situation, train 214 was entirely on that segment. It did not overlap with any other segment being monitored. And so the automatic trail control system was not able to inform train 112 that there was a train ahead of it. And so it directed this train to proceed, and it moved forward at 55 miles an hour. There's also, very unfortunately in this incident, a strong bend. So the train operator was actually able to pull the emergency brake as soon as the other train came into view. But it was too late at that point. They were only able to slow the train down from 55 miles an hour down to 49 miles an hour. And this is a view from the next day as recovery efforts continued. You'll see that one subway ended up entirely telescoped on top of the other. That's how quickly they hit. And this is why measuring is so important as opposed to just monitoring. Because monitoring, again, gives you a bunch of data, and that data may be very useful. There may be many, many instances where you may, in fact, have to care about that. But measuring asks the question, what is true about the world today? What is the actual state of things in terms of my system? And now here you might be like, hey, are you talking about observability? I keep hearing this word, right? What's observability versus monitoring? And observability has become really kind of like a hip new Gartner word with its own magic quadrants and all that. And every monitoring vendor now claims that they're an observability vendor. Is that entirely true? I don't know. It depends on how you want language to evolve. But the term observability did in fact originate in control theory. And control theory is at the root of everything that we're currently talking about. Control theory has been around since the 1800s. 1863 is the first time control theory was used in an academic paper, so a very long time, more than 150 years. This is where the term observability actually came from, way before it was ever applied to computer systems. And the goals of control theory is to better define what control you may have and what understanding you may have of dynamic systems, or what we often refer to as complex systems today, which most of our computer systems also fall under. And by getting a better understanding of what control you have in terms of what can you change about things, and what you can observe about things, what can you understand about the system, what measurements can you get out of it, you can use that data to bring about better system stability. So the term parasitic oscillation that we were just talking about, right? This track control system that was entering a bad state and a good state and a bad state and a good state over and over and over again, control theory has always existed to account for that kind of stuff. Right? You don't have to just say, okay, that's flapping, well, let's ignore the alerts, which is what the DC Metro system did. You could say, okay, this is flapping, so let's adjust the thresholds for what good or bad actually means. And that would allow you, using control theory, would allow you to account for that better, and perhaps that day people would still have been able to know whether or not there was, in fact, a train on that section of tracks. And all of that allows you to bring better stability into your systems. And all of this is also explicitly defined as aiming for optimability, because nothing's perfect. Most of my talks are about SLOs, service level objectives, right? That's, if you know who I am, that's kind of what I'm all about. I'm not going to talk about it a ton here, but it's just another great example that not aiming for perfection has really been built into how engineers approach most problems for a very, very long time. You aim for optimability. You aim to be as good as you can be. You don't aim for 100%. And control theory led into control systems engineering. At least that's what's academically known in the US. In Europe, it's generally referred to as automation engineering. And by now, I hope you're starting to see some of the parallels between these very old disciplines that existed way before the concept of modern computers, especially distributed online web services, ever existed, and what we do as SRE, as DevOps, as people attending Monitorama, the things we might care about. These are very similar goals that we have. They're very similar approaches. And that's really what I want the main takeaway here to be, is that there are decades and decades of research and study from fields outside of computers that can help us better think about how we need to be monitoring and measuring our own systems. We spend way too much time in tech reinventing things over and over and over. Everything has to be invented in our... Corey's talk earlier, right? Like build versus buy. I don't know. I don't know the answer exactly when you should build and when you should buy, but we do spend way too much time building. We spend way too much time as an industry ignoring the lessons that so many other brilliant, brilliant people before us learned, even if they were lessons learned far away from software. And the problem here is that too often we monitor. I know this conference is called Monitorama, and I love Monitorama, and Measuranama doesn't really roll off the tongue, so I don't think we can rename it. But there is a distinction. There is a difference between collecting data and understanding the state of a system, and I think we need to spend more time differentiating in between those two things. Because measuring takes into account the actual operational requirements that you have. So monitoring, you install the statsd library or daemon, and suddenly you have a bunch of data like, here's how much RAM I'm using, and here's how this process is currently eating up kernel time, and that's sometimes useful. Again, I'm not saying don't do that, but that doesn't really tell you anything about what your system looks like in the real world. And this is exactly the problem that the DC Metro ran into. They were monitoring their system, but they weren't able to measure it. Because if they were able to measure it, they would have been able to say, we understand where train 214 currently is, and therefore we know the correct inputs to send to train 112. But they weren't able to measure, and therefore a horrible, horrible incident happened. And there's so many more examples. So we're going to go through just a few here. And this is, again, where I love NTSB reports. On 9:44 Central Standard Time on December 19th of 2011, a Piper PA-32 plane with a tail number of N3590T crashed in Texas. This is a pretty sad story, but it's a very, very interesting one if you're interested in how systems work and how we monitor systems. And it was a small passenger plane. It was being operated by a father, his brother-in-law, his wife, and 2 kids. And they were flying from Atlanta to Waco, Texas. And they flew into bad weather. And they knew that they were going to be flying into bad weather. This was known before they took off, right? Like air traffic control, first Nashville, and then they handed off to Houston, let them know that, like things were bad. And the plane actually had, for its time, incredibly advanced onboard weather, detection and radar display. And so the pilot felt pretty confident about how they would be able to fly across the country and kind of avoid the worst parts of this weather system. But the problem is this is all on a delay. And the onboard display actually informs the pilot of how long this delay is. But it informs them of how long the delay is in between once the data has been entirely collected and once it's been uploaded from the ground to the airplane. So that delay read about 1 minute. But what this does not account for is the fact that it took 5 to 6 minutes for the next rad systems on the ground to collect the data. So the display told this pilot that the weather data that they were looking at, the radar that they were looking at, the wind speeds that they were looking at was 1 minute delayed. But in actuality, it was 6 to 7, if not 8 minutes delayed from what was actually happening in the real world, what the actual state of the world was. And because of this, the operator, the pilot, made a mistake, thought he was turning around a particularly bad, like weather patch, and unfortunately steered right into it. And unfortunately, that plane crashed. Because it's not a measurement if you don't know your offset. It's just monitoring. If you don't understand how the data you're collecting directly applies to the actual real world, whether or not that be a time offset, whether or not that means you have to, divide it by 100, or whatever it might be. If the data that you're collecting via your monitoring is not telling you what's actually going on, then it's not a measurement and it's not useful. Another example that most of you probably remember, a little after midnight UTC time, June 1st, 2009, Air France flight 447 crashed. This was a pretty famous incident. And although nothing was ever fully determined, because you can't really know if you weren't in the cockpit at the time, but the general investigations that took over 18 months, whatever data they were able to get out of the systems, they're pretty sure that the problem was the airspeed numbers were inconsistent. So the fluid flow sensors, which is just, gases of fluid, how many particles of air are passing through these sensors over X period of time, tells you how fast the plane is moving. And these were unfortunately iced over a bit. So the sensors were not able to consistently tell the pilots or any of the cockpit instruments or any of the other automated systems, they were not able to understand how quickly the plane was actually moving. If you drive a car, you might think that you can kind of guess, right, by how quick the trees on the side of the road are passing you by. You maybe have some understanding of how quickly you're driving. And I remember once I was driving through the back parts of Pennsylvania, and it was empty. And I was just driving, and suddenly my engine shut off because I hit my governor. Because a lot of cars have a governor at 108 miles an hour that will turn off any acceleration until you drop back below 100, because I had nothing to judge from. Everything was empty. I had no idea how quick I was moving, And so it may be easy to want to try to say, well, okay, even if their sensors weren't working, they have some idea how quick they're moving. No, they had no clue. If you're up in the air, you have nothing to really judge things off of. If your dials, if your instruments aren't properly telling you how fast you're moving, you have almost no clue as a pilot. And because they didn't know this, their automated stall detection systems also didn't know. So they pulled up at a point where they should have pulled down, and they entered a stall, but they didn't know that they entered a stall, right? And a stall is just, the most colloquial way, it's a point in time where your engines on an airplane are no longer pushing you forward quick enough to ensure you're still able to establish lift in terms of the exact, degrees that you're facing away from pure horizontal, right? So, but the point is, this plane entered a stall at this point, and the pilots were not made aware of it because they didn't know how fast they were going, which means their stall detection alarms didn't know how fast they were going. And next thing we know, the plane was not able to stay aloft. It crashed into the Atlantic Ocean, and 225 people died. Because it's not a measurement if your alarms can't fire. You're still just monitoring at that point, right? If you can't account for real world conditions, like the sensor's icing over slightly, then you're not measuring, you're just collecting data, you're just monitoring. So if there are a few takeaways, I didn't touch a lot on computer systems here. I didn't talk a lot about exactly how you might fix this for yourselves, and because the answer there is, everyone's favorite answer, it depends. It depends on what your systems look like. It depends on what your numbers look like. It depends on exactly how you're able to measure them in the first place, whether or not you have financial constraints, whether or not you have technological constraints. But the point is, I hope, be thoughtful. Think about what you're collecting. Think about the data. Think about why you're monitoring the things you're monitoring. Again, we're at Monitorama. This is all about data collection. This is all about how can we get data out of our computer systems and into other systems that let us analyze them or understand them or alert humans or do pretty graphs in Grafana, right? Like whatever it might be. The thing though is if you're not thoughtful about what those numbers actually mean, it can lead to disaster. And you can only do that if you're auditing your data. You need to not just be collecting thoughtfully, you need to be making sure that what you're collecting is in fact what you think you're collecting. I'm 40 now, I've been in this industry for a long time. I cannot tell you how many times I've ran into terrible incidents because the numbers on my dashboard or the numbers that triggered a page or didn't trigger a page literally were not what we all thought they were. I mean, tangent that I wasn't planning on going on, but like real quick, I remember at one point we discovered, I was in charge of a large elk cluster, right, an Elasticsearch log / Kibana cluster, and did like 350,000 log ingestions per minute, super quick, and we were running into just contention issues and ingestion problems, and I was like, okay, cool, let me go see if the network links are saturated. So I go to the dashboard that had been created years ago that helped you see, all the general compute resources, right? Remember usage CPU, usage disk utilization, network utilization. Someone had applied a divide by 1024 to all the network ingress and egress, when in fact that metric that was being collected did not need to be. It already was in megs and it didn't need to be converted. So we were off by like, a huge order of magnitude. And that kind of thing can bite all of us in the ass, and it does all the time. So go make sure you know what your numbers actually are. Make sure you audit them on occasion. Assign this to someone. Make it part of sprint work if you have to. Know and double check that the data you're collecting is what you think it is. And that also includes ensuring that your data collection systems are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Because it doesn't matter if your systems are exposing the correct data and the correct metrics if the systems ingesting them end up changing them or don't ultimately make them actually meaningful. And the biggest takeaway here is just, yes, monitoring is important. Collecting data is important. In a perfect world with unlimited resources, collect every single bit of data about every single component of every system you have, because you don't know when that might come in handy. But monitoring is not measuring. Measuring is intentful. Measuring has a goal. Measuring tells you, what is my system actually doing in terms of its operational requirements? This is not always easy. This often requires a lot of work. But I believe in every single one of you, and you can make your systems be great. Thank you.
All right, we got a few more minutes before break, so if anyone have any questions, yeah, fire them away. We got some time.
You can ask me about anything, even if it's not about monitoring versus measuring, if you want.
Think of this question there? Yeah.
How do you feel about the efforts with positive drain control in terms of the response to that metric incident?
Like in terms of the changes they actually made to their system? Yeah, so I think actually it was a decent effort, and we're getting into real NTSB analysis nerddom here. So I'm also happy to chat with you more after this. But answer is that the DC Metro spent 18 months analyzing every single track circuit they had. Noticed that 6 of them were entirely fallible. Those 6 were responsible for up to 8,000 false alerts per day, which is why so many of them were just ignored. And most of those 6, including, so in my talk I mentioned that that track circuit had been replaced 5 days before that accident, but that track circuit had actually been malfunctioning for 18 months because the problem was not actually in the track circuit systems. It was part of the relays off of the track going into those systems in the first place, which is actually kind of another great like anecdote to share, right? So like they knew this set of tracks was not reporting the right data, so they went and they replaced the monitoring system on top of it, right? Like they replaced the controller and the computer that was measuring this track, but it turned out the actual problem had been happening for 18 months and was because the tracks themselves could not report the correct data. So no matter how many times they would have replaced that track controller, they never would have gotten good data out of it. But the audit, I think, was pretty comprehensive, and the DC Metro has not had a major incident since.
I think there was one other question over there. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, like, which came first, your work on SLI, SLO, or the systems engineering and investigating crashes and other things better?
Sorry, I couldn't totally hear you. My interest in SLOs or my interest in incidents?
Yeah, like system incidents, yes.
My interest in incidents and understanding how systems operate, that's been a passion of mine for a very, very long time. I was not introduced to the concept of SLOs until 7 or 8 years ago when I was at Google. I very quickly fell in love with them because I think a very important part of thinking about systems is understanding how often they can possibly actually meet their operational requirements as opposed to aiming for 100% uptime. So yeah, now my thing might be SLOs, but my passion has long been understanding system failures, systems of any size, how they fail, how systems operate in the first place. That's kind of the root of what got me into why I'm talking to you today.
Awesome. Last call. Any other questions? Cool. Well, let's do one more round of applause here for Alex.